Welcome everyone to the launch of Cleaves Itself. Today I'm joined by Jeda Pearl, and we're here to celebrate the publication day of her debut collection, Cleaves Itself. Thank you so much for joining me, Jeda. The publication of your poetry collection. Jeda Pearl is a Scottish Jamaican writer. Her poems and stories appear in art installations and several anthologies. Her debut poetry collection, Cleaves Itself, is forthcoming from People Tree Press, or rather, it's here today, yay! And you can find her online at Jeda Pearl. In 2022, she was shortlisted for the Sky Arts RSL Award and longlisted for the Women's Poets Prize. Art installations include Windrush Legacy Creative Reflections, 2023, Caledonian Biotech Library, 3033? Okay, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that.
It's set next millennium.
Amazing, amazing. Scottish Storytelling Centre 2022 and Acts of Observation Collective in 2021. Performances include StAnza, Hidden Door, Push, and The Boat Out. You're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of this.
Cymera.
Okay, excuse me.
Think.
And Edinburgh International Book Festival. Her poems and short stories are published by New Writing Scotland, Open Book, Not Going Back to Normal, Shoreline, of Infinity, and Aesthetica. I think I got that right. Again, beautiful book. Cleaves Itself explores a disabled Scottish woman of colour's experiences in the way that she navigates the intersections of her identity in between worlds, belonging and claiming space. Landscapes and bodyscapes are brought into the focus through lenses of race, illness, disability, and womanhood. Ancestral languages of Scots, Patois, Geordie and English critique ableism, colonialism, and Scottish exceptionalism. They ask, who gets the trees? Honour Caribbean Scottish heritage, and move from the bed as universe to the fantastical and science-fictional imaginings. Barney Capiljo is quoted stating, "The bounding, intelligent wondrousness of Cleaves Itself challenges readers who may have despaired about where song belongs in challenging times, with the appetite and exactitude we would expect more of ancient poets than nowadays." Jeda Pearl traces ammonite patterns, praises scientific endeavours, speaks from the dance floor and hospital bed. No narrow thing. Perspectives click, Pearl speakers freely observe their observers and move on. Swimming and flying creatures, and the kestrel in the chest, the selkie self, duppies, and hummingbirds. What world is this collection from? These poems inhabit and unlock the famed energy of both Scots and Caribbean literary heritage. Knowing them intertwined of old, I'm overjoyed to see the poetry's future in Jeda Pearl's work. So, quite a long introduction. Welcome once again, Jeda. An absolute pleasure to have you. And before I forget, the amazing cover is by your sister, Kezia Lewis. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Rowan. So, to explore a few different themes in this book, I'm going to read a poem from the third part. It is partly a grief poem, but it's also saying and reflecting on some of the other themes in the book. It's called Plantain, I Long for You. 1. Cooking you without him feels like betrayal. But I miss the sweet starch crystallized edges of you. Too hot, melt in the mouth between the stodge of buttered white bread. I miss the ink staining my hands as I unwrap you from weeks old newsprint. I long for his impatience and mine as we checked on you weekly, daily. Remember the serious work of inspection, gentle prodding with thumb tip to suss for ripe and readiness. His precisely angled slices. Anticipation, his dramatic flourish, the tension and hiss as your raw edges slipped into pan fire oil. Waiting for your honeyed, sizzling amber ovals to cool. The gap in the veg basket when you were all gone. I miss the way I must lay you in my palm, press the small, unflinching knife into your ripening skin, score you gently while keeping you whole. 2. How you travelled. Precious. Nestled next to yam, red fruit, raw cane sugar, avocado pear, nostalgia, culture teachings, recreations, sweetened condensed milk, nutmeg, allspice. Fried fish, salt fish, fish tea, kipper breakfast, fruit loaf, fruit buns, fruit juice, fruit bowl never empty. Ripening hopes, anti-races, post-colonial, art views, science futures, every opportunity for education, Scotch bonnets, all the reggae and all the rhythm, red, gold and green. A hold all could never hold it all. Before the machete, part 3. Before you reach boat, a tree held you in a family of fruit, green on a strong trunk. They call a pseudostem. Before you reached fruit, a critically endangered leaf-nosed bat, guided by echolocation, pollinated your yellow flowers gathered round large vermilion bracts. Before you reached flower, rise on root, send out the pups to grow tree tall, with canoe-shaped leaves paddling the hot blue sky.
Thank you, Jada. That was absolutely lovely. Let's begin by talking about this poem, Plantain I Long For You, being about grief. And in your collection, there are quite a few poems on grief. Why did you make the decision to write about grief?
So something I wanted to other my writing, both fiction and poetry, death or bereavement, a theme that I return to, and then more recent years, the most recent 2 bereavements they had as a family were both my parents inside of 2 years of each other. Yeah, so I've always turned to writing when times are hard, and so and kind of going through bereavement and grieving has been no exception to that. And I think I know that grief is something that we carry with us for the rest of our lives. It's not something that kind of we get over. And I think also it's a topic that can still be quite taboo and not spoken about very much in this country. And it felt important to me because I was kind of, some of the other themes that I kind of explore in my poetry in the book are also maybe kind of things that aren't talked about so much. It felt important to me to include that, and it kind of links into some of the ways we can experience time when we are grieving. I think it's important that we address it's something that every single human on the planet will face, is bereavement, and I think it's important that we have spaces to kind of explore that and connect with how we process those things.
Mm-hmm. Let's discuss the intersections of your ideas and how they've shaped your experiences.
So I suppose there is this I suppose there is this mixed race experience. It can be this in-between experience where you have a number of cultures that are your heritage, and then you also have this new culture that within your own family that's kind of this new thing. And also being Scottish, person of colour, a person of colour, growing up and living in Scotland, there is also that feeling of, everyone wants to belong. It's like a natural human urge. But there can be this experience when you are a minority, you don't belong here, and there is this experience of, well, because you're a Black person or a person of colour, even with your Scottish accent, you're not necessarily seen as Scottish. That question of where are you from, you know, and I know there's a lot of folk talk about that, but that is quite a common experience for folk in this country. And so yeah, so there's those kind of intersections, which then also intersect with the legacy of colonialism, particularly within my own family, with the transatlantic slave trade as well. And where I would learn about that history was inside my own household, you know, from like my dad, for example, who's Jamaican. And so and not in school. It was absolutely not covered in school. And my children, who are young adults now, really, with my younger child, has it started to be kind of looked at a bit more closely in high school. So it's still, it's, you know, there's still a lot of kind of hidden stories, yeah, that I think are coming into the light a bit more now, but not enough. So that's, I suppose, where you know, and that experience of surviving, you know, racist environments, and then there's also surviving, you know, health scares, and you know, so there's a, I suppose it's kind of finding those things that for me personally are of interest and intersect.
Mm-hmm. You mention survival as well as your writing. What would you say is another creative output that sort of keeps you grounded, I think would be the best word to use?
Yeah, so you know, so I was born in the late 70s, so I grew up, you know, in the 80s and the early 90s, and I'm the eldest of my siblings, and so yeah, back then there really weren't a lot of, you know, there were, and there always have been, Black people and people of color in Scotland for a very, very, very long time. But at the time when I was growing up, you know, you can feel quite isolated. And that's still, I'm hearing from, you know, generation younger than me are still feeling that isolation. So it's still something that exists. But yeah, so there was that aspect. And I think things that our parents really impressed upon us was that for us to kind of find what it was we were interested in and explore that, and this kind of attitude of lifelong learning. Creativity was quite big, as well as sort of more scientific science or scientific subjects as well. So there is this, I suppose, I don't know if the word, if it's polymath, if that's the right word, but there is, that's a kind of an yeah, that I grew up in, which was, you know, very liberating in some ways. That I was encouraged to explore, whether that was because I went to art school actually in the 90s, so I was exploring a different type of creativity. Because when I was, yeah, I suppose one of my teachers in my early days at high school, kind of when I was like a tender 13-year-old or 14-year-old, really kind of left quite a negative impression on me about my writing. And so I kind of turned away from that, and turned to other creative subjects. But then I always returned to writing in different ways. I would write songs. I would, you know, back then you had pen pals. I had heaps of pen pals. You know, so I was always returning to writing or writing in a diary and things like that. So yeah, there's, I think it's you know, creative. Everyone's creative. Everyone can be creative. It doesn't really matter what it is you produce, but I think it's really important. And even if it's just like curating playlists of songs that you love that really just, you know, ground you, get you back to center, make you feel more alive, you know. So there's lots of different ways people can be creative, and I do count things like food and cooking as a creative subject as well. So yeah, I've got quite a wide a wide idea of what counts as creativity.
Amazing. Your work is also very much inspired by the shared languages in your family, which include Scots, Geordie, and Jamaican Patois. Talk a little bit about that and sort of the influences of, I guess, growing up in an environment where I guess there'd be a lot of code switching, I assume. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I think yeah, so it's interesting because even now, when I'm with folk that have a Scottish accent, I will lean more into my Scottish accent
Mm.
more, right? Um, so yeah, it's quite interesting. My So on my mother's side, it's Scottish and Irish quite quickly, actually, within the kind of generations. But yeah, so she was from, yeah, my granddad was a miner, and so they moved for work to Northumberland, and that's where the Geordie comes from. So my mum grew up Geordie, even though she's Scottish roots, if you see what I mean. So it's, you know, when her, I suppose, when she was learning language and in her formative years, she had a Geordie accent. And then, you know, my dad had his Jamaican patois, which would ebb and flow depending on what was happening and who he was speaking to. And I think I really shied away from initially in my writing from using those languages. I didn't feel confident to claim them. And so part of my journey, especially with poetry, was a sort of reclamation of making space for myself, for people like me, people that sound like me, and, you know, kind of reclaiming those languages. And yes, I can speak those languages, although, you know, the first few times that you're performing, you know, in Scots or what have you, it's terrifying. But I think it's an important thing to for people to feel comfortable, you know, kind of using the languages that is their heritage.
Are there any specific sort of writers that come to mind that have not only shaped your writing, but you remember from growing up, given those influences?
So apparently, when I was like really little, like a baby, I barely slept, but my mum would just give me a book. So like I had my head in a book from like quite a young age. And yeah, so our mum was really great at managing somehow to find books that had children that looked like us in them. So that was, yeah, you know, just amazing that she was able to do that. Um, one of, I think, the earliest books that I like have a quite close affinity of, just I think because of the story, and I related to it, and it's, you know, it's a picture book. Is My Brother Sean by Petronella Breinberg. And yeah, that just the illustrations are beautiful, beautiful paintings, and yeah, so that was quite I suppose my first kind of book where I maybe felt a bit more represented. Um, and then when I was a young adult and like kind of looking for books myself, it was maybe a bit more challenging in kind of maybe some of the local bookshops and the local libraries and things. But I did manage to find so for like one of my kind of big essays in high school, I wrote an essay on Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. So initially it was American authors, right? But then when I must have been in my, you know, early 20s, very early, or just into my 20s, and I found Andrea Levy. And so the first book of hers I read was Never Far From Nowhere. And I was like, oh my goodness, I felt so seen, you know, that was really beautiful. So I just like devoured all of her books that I could get my hands on. And I've always really loved, yeah, like I've really kind of have a strong affinity with her work. And then, you know, but later in life as an adult, you know, diving into a lot of other kind of authors, Octavia E. Butler, for example, getting into kind of more speculative stuff's been really fun.
Something that I really wanted us to touch upon is, well, two things really. Um, why you made the decision to write about ableism, and I guess the parallels or distinctions between sort of ableism and it wouldn't be anti-ableism, but I guess ableism and accessibility or lack of accessibility, and how you've made the choice to make your writing more accessible, make your readings more accessible.
So I became chronically ill about, yeah, I suppose about kind of 10, 15 years ago. And, you know, that experience really brought me up, you know, to interrogate my own ableism that was like pretty big, to be honest. So that was really interesting to, you know, when you start interrogating the, you know, your own sort of biases and all of that, and understanding some of the external reasons as to why they exist, as well as internal. And, you know, external examples could be things like just the lack of representation of disabled people in the media, for example. So, or the problematic way that disabled people have been represented at times by people who are non-disabled. So so for me, this is maybe been, I suppose, in my lifetime, a more recent experience. And I was actually encouraged by two writers, San Alland and Alec Finlay, to kind of explore that side of myself in my writing. And that was a really empowering experience to do that. So and in the book, you know, there are poems that are kind of talking about, you know, some of those issues of like the ableism that exists, and also that experience, you know, because there's a lot of folk who maybe have medical trauma, for example, because of their negative experiences, and that is absolutely not to take away from our incredible NHS that we have, which is a real privilege. And you know, my last poem in the book speaks to that side of things, Ode to the Nurses in Ward 6, because I have experienced both the life-saving, you know, and also some negative experiences as well, sadly. And I just, I wanted to, so I'd begun to write about that side of things, and then there was an exhibition at an art gallery called Collective, which is on the top of Carlton Hill. And so some of the poems, like Up Carlton Hill, when it's talking about who gets the trees, and kind of accessing nature as well. So yeah, I wanted to kind of touch on a few points, that some which are personal for me, but also do speak to maybe like a wider experience. And yeah, there's a poem called Sublime Bodies Reveal Themselves, which I tried to kind of have a very, just, I wanted to write an empowering piece after kind of thinking about, you know, interrogating things and, you know, exploring some of the issues. It's really important to have, you know, a space to feel empowered, I think.
You're very, very reflective about your experiences. I wondered what you would advise a young person who you know, has many intersections to their identity, what you'd advise them about writing and reflecting on their experiences, because I can only imagine that at times, or the initial process of writing can be quite difficult. Do you sort of have a ritual? Do you, I don't know, have a office in your shed? Do you lock yourself away? Do you go on a retreat? Like how do you start honing in on you know, this process of writing poems, writing fiction? What would you advise someone who wants to start and write but doesn't know where to begin?
So I think something that yeah, you can do for yourself, and this is also a note to myself as well, because we don't always follow our own advice. But yeah, I think something that I have noticed that can be helpful is about giving yourself permission to write whatever it is you want to write. So And I feel like some of that might come across in the book as well. Like the first part is, you know, looking a bit more at like my you know, like this the experience of, you know, being a person of color, growing up that way in Scotland, and how to kind of, you know, claim this home and space. So, but that's not all I want to write about, right? And you shouldn't be expected, because you you know have a certain identity, that you must write only about that. So I think it's about giving yourself permission. It's also about I suppose telling your inner child that they're safe, they can play, they can have fun. Because the very first poems I had published were actually science fiction poems, and I, I, the only reason I felt able to write those was because they were science fiction, and I saw this call, and I was like, oh, that could be fun, and I just, you know, my inner child came forward and had that experience. And so I think that would be my encouragement, is like to find a way to bring your inner child out, and to, you have to have the editing head, but you want to kind of leave that to one side, and then lean into that later. And just to, you know, because I am partially housebound, it means my world can be quite small in terms of like getting out and about and things like that. So, you know, you can, one of the great things about poetry is you can like kind of really kind of push into like, or what's like, shine a lamp on like really little, really kind of specific elements sometimes. And so yeah, so sometimes that has been literally the sky, because my bedroom's in an attic, and so the sky that's above me when I'm, you know, having to rest in bed. So it's looking at, or not necessarily looking with your eyes, but like depending on yeah, your yeah, obviously if you're blind, you're not going to be able to do that. So it's experiencing, finding ways to experience both the external world as well as your own internal world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we'll end on that profound note. Thank you so much for chatting with me, Jada. Let's end off with a reading.
I think it might be quite nice to read Ossify. And this poem, you know what, I'm just going to read it, and then, you know, you can experience it that way. Ossify. Stonewise, you were placed here, laid down by her might, the Ice Queen. Skirts carving the valley, your scruff worn smooth by praying hands. Lichen eats at jasper limbs, sleet rivulets across slate faces. Hail pummels granite scalps. Wait for sun. Wait for worshipping teens, budding nipples solidifying under cotton as they cup the dew from your feet. Slit the winter solstice, jut into lunar moth light. A maiden, a mother, a crone. Ignored by ignorant men with their tidal compasses and pointless demarcations, refusing land story, laying claim. Shattered, you turn to jet quartz. Salt, slow, glacial cold sets in, crawls up your toenails, picks up your shin shafts, lodges in the clefts of your knee. You join the carnival of stone women gliding up mountain, brittle arches cracking against rigid ground. Arms goddess high, faces glistening, to welcome the cleansing rain, while your sleekit shadows dance, forsaking the moon-dropped sky.
Wow. Thank you very much, Jada. That was incredible. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
dialects, whether or how each dialect, the Scottish, the Jamaican, your mother's varied dialect, specifically influenced your writing, kind of unbraiding them in a way, if you would. Thank you.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you for that question. So I think with those languages and dialects, something that I really love about them is that they can be quite musical. They can often sound, the sound of them is quite often gets the meaning across, even if you maybe don't know what the words mean. The sound, yeah, there's a particular sound, and so I think there are times when I will mix those dialects with English in poems, and times when I will stick to one. And I'm not, yeah, so, sometimes part of, say, like, you know, sometimes it's a deliberate choice to choose to look and do more research into, for example, say Scots, and you know, and part of that kind of, you know, learning more about the language as well is important. And then at other times, it can be quite intuitive, and I maybe go more on sound. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, I know for myself, growing up in Bermuda, and also speaking in dialect when I choose to, that at a very young age, even though dialect is a form of English, I learned the power of language. You know, that just a dialect intonation could, as you're talking about, shift the meaning of words. And that was just, you know, such a great thing to learn. Thank you so much for your brilliant answer. It's lovely to have you here, and your poems are over the top. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Loretta, you popped a question in the chat, but would you like to ask Jada that question live?
Yes, hi Jada. I've enjoyed everything so much so far. I'm also interested, although I didn't write this part in the chat. Oh, I did, on writing about disabilities or ableism. But I had asked in the chat about the future. As I've read some of your poems online, but I haven't read ones that have a sci-fi or speculative or futuristic elements. So I'm really interested in how you're imagining the future, given the kind of positionalities that you've talked about. If you imagine Caribbean futures, if you imagine Scottish Caribbean futures, etc. And I see that Anthony also gave a follow-up question about folklore, which is great. That's my question.
Yeah, so I think I suppose I really love delving into kind of mythological and folkloric stories, or research, and those will come in sometimes quite subtly into my work, and then from a science fictional perspective, I would say that sometimes it's kind of, yes, sometimes there's maybe a couple of poems in the book where it's, yeah, trying to, I suppose, almost be a poem that I kind of wish I had access to, that in terms of like a permission to imagine, you know. So I think that's something I felt quite called to maybe hope that that's kind of can be an encouraging environment for some people that read those poems that are a bit more speculative, to encourage that taking from sort of Afrofuturism, or there's one, for example, called Notes for an Apprentice Archivist, and that came out of looking at an artist called Maud Salter, who was a Black Scottish artist who was publishing poems and making visual art like back in the 80s. But I didn't come across her work until I was like, you know, into my like 30s. And to be able to access some of her archive, and it was, you know, I wanted to almost like pass the baton on to say, you know, yeah, just to encourage others to be thinking along those lines from a futurist perspective. And while we can project from, I suppose, where we are and where we want to be, you know, and it's trying to be realistic, but also have that sort of positive imagination of an environment of that a lot more of us would really like to be living in.
Would you please mention the name of the artist again?
Yes, I will. I'll put her name in the chat as well. Her name is Maud Salter. So yeah, I'm gonna just pop her name in the chat because there's been like quite a lot of interesting work happening in Scotland around her archive recently.
And the poem is Notes for an Apprentice.
Yes, it's called Notes for an Apprentice Archive. Okay, so Notes for an Apprentice Archivist for Maud Salter. As we walk this imperial tightrope, untangling the travelling threads, our sepia fingers comb through mounds of data, slip out half-truths, free reams of evidence. Ancestral stories wrapped in chromosomes are embodied homeward down familial lines. Linked to East African mitochondrial Eve, your legacy crafting starts now. Steep your roots in contrary rebellion. Stay dangerous. Don't dare conform. It's time to add to our quilt continuum. Cranky, lustful, contented, judicious, all styles accepted. Every human contains equal counts of melanocytes, yet our blooms of melanin are uniquely ours. I think that kind of gets across what I was trying to say, perhaps.
Oh, lovely. And that's
Thanks.
on page 15 to anyone who has a book. Yeah, and I guess our final question will be from Anthony. I think it follows up from Loretta's question.
Hi, thank you. So very briefly, I'd be interested to hear something about the other beings like selkies and duppies that you write about, and how does this perhaps give a means of reflecting on the kind of creatures that we are as humans, and are there particular Scottish and or Caribbean creatures that you enjoy being, or are there Scots or Patois words or phrases for our creatureliness or the way we use our bodies that you particularly like? So it's really just a question of creatures, words. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for a beautiful reading.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anthony. Wow, that's a question I would love to just like sit and write a response to. So I think, yeah, I suppose there are some creatures that I have an affinity with, or I maybe return to in my work. For example, in terms of like Scots and Geordie, there's a little bit of a contention about who, you know, where the Selkie really comes from. But yeah, so Selkies I think are really interesting to me because of and they also link in with mer creatures as well, like mermaids, mer creatures, which I don't know. I've quite often been drawn to water, so that's maybe why I'm kind of interested in those beings, and what they can potentially represent or explore, in terms of how they exist and what kind of stories they can make and be part of, and with some of sort of Jamaican superstitions, and I don't know if that's really the right word, but so I would maybe say more beliefs. I am really interested in the silk cotton tree, and what that tree and the spirits that exist there, what that represents, and also maybe how you know, how sometimes, yeah, I suppose I have a curiosity around folkloric stories, and how they perhaps have changed as they have been told with this oral storytelling that we have in both cultures, and how we can continue to evolve those stories.
Zoe has a question, and then we have a question from Carol.
Hi, yeah, I wasn't too sure if there was time, but yeah, hi, I'm Zoe, Zoe Larimer, and yeah, also from Scotland, and yeah, Jeda, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And yeah, I just had a question about like how you feel performing Scots now and incorporating it into your work, because I remember you specifically saying like it can be quite scary or like terrifying performing Scots, and I was just wondering if you still feel that way, and you know, like being based in Scotland, is there like, is that where the fear comes from, and do you have like a fear when you're you know, performing other dialects? Yeah, that was kind of the gist of my question.
I would say that I do have a fear when I'm performing other dialects, and maybe that's kind of maybe based around maybe where I am and who the audience happens to be, and so because of how my Scottish accent might come across if I'm like performing patois words, so yeah, so I would say it's not just only Scots that I get that fear with. But I feel that it's important to sort of power through to kind of reclaim that. One of the things that really frustrates me, which is just like a really practical thing, is that something that's quite common is when people perform is some of us get really dry mouths. And so to be able to roll your R's when you've got dry mouth is like impossible. So I'm having to accept that I'm not going to be able to roll my R's in my Scots quite as often as I would like to. So, but I feel like I'm getting more comfortable with it as time has been gone on, and it's, you know, you get a bit more practice.
Thanks for your question, Zoe. And finally, Carol Duncan.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the beautiful reading, and congratulations on the publication. So, yeah, speaking of hybrid identities, I'm British-born Windrush migrants, Antiguan and Guyanese, and way back on my mom's side, great-great-grandchild of a Scot who moved to the Caribbean ages ago. Anywho, so my question is about the visual iconography of the flags, you know, and other points of visual iconography connecting Scotland and Jamaica. And I'd love to hear you reflect on that. You know, the only two flags that have that St. Andrew's cross. Does that have any meaning for you?
Yeah, I think it's something that I know Jamaican heritage folk here have, you know, talked about. It's known, and it's maybe we try and point it out to people, because it's a very simple visual way to kind of show how interconnected Scottish and Caribbean history is, specifically Jamaica. So, and Scotland's, we're doing much better than we used to with all of that, and there's a lot of interest, including in the Scottish government, of like trying to decolonize, and there's discussions about what how can we be making sure that Scotland's really aware of all the history and the links that we have with the Caribbean, and there's that, I think for many of us probably on this call, it's very obvious for us, but for folk who maybe don't have Caribbean heritage, it can, and specifically people who have grown up in the UK and Scotland, who are white and maybe don't have any friends who have this heritage, then they're just maybe not going to know, because there's not as much kind of education happening. So yeah, I think there's such a wealth of history there, and I think there's some really beautiful ways we could take things forward together as countries. So but I don't want to get too political. And I'm watching the time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Final request, Jeda, from Loretta. She says, is it possible to read a poem that includes the code switching of the various languages you're working on? And Anthony says, yes, please. And I say, please, too. And I think Anthony says one small poem.
One small poem. Thank you. It's really lovely, all the comments. So I have a longer poem that there is a video of, that I did post kind of recently on my social media. And it's like my one video on my YouTube channel, which does have both Scots and Jamaican patois in, and the sort of code switching stuff. But it's a bit longer, so I'm going to read a shorter one. And this was one of gosh, this is quite an early poem in terms of when I wrote it. And this was like a really sort of reclaiming this space for myself here. It's called Lashed to This Unseelie Court Since 1655. You fortify yourself when you see it, that knowing look in their jellied squid eyes, where to place you among the condiments in their spice cupboard, a collectible figurine. Weather in your eyes turns dreich. They notice not. Lay your accent on in muckle drop-scone dollops. Pointless. Ancestors roar, invisible behind your lips. Now it is time, say the duppies. Pull up them saggy shoulders, gal, then I know you. Anchor them feet there so, the Scots run in your blood way back. This land, this ear land, is drucket with your blood. Don't divulge your mother, father, mother, father, mother, father, mother, father, mother, father, mother, father, mother, for them to filch again. There we go.
Thank you so much, Jeda. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wind down. Thank you all for attending. Times Cleaves Itself is available as of today. Thank you for coming and celebrating with us. Thank you, Jeda, for being here. Thank you for all your patience. And if you would like a copy, you can get 20% off when you put TIME, TIME, in the checkout. Link is in our bios on all socials. And look forward to hearing from you soon.
Much, yeah, it really is. Yeah,
Thank you,
it's been really special.